Welcome to the Red Light Expose podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations,
we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey. Welcome back to Red Light Expose podcast. This episode is part of our Men for Equality series, where we highlight the voices of 8 men who are doing important work that supports the movement to end commercial sexual exploitation. These men are survivor activists, policy advisors, and passionate changemakers. Red Light Expose thanks Empower Men for their generosity in helping to make this series possible. You can check out and support the great work they are doing on their website, empowermen.ca. In this episode, you will hear Merle Åsbogård interviewing Max Waltman. They'll be discussing the Swedish approach to commercial sexual exploitation, how Sweden deals with prostitution, and later how it's now starting to deal with pornography. Just as a reminder, the Swedish or Nordic Model approach to the sex industry involves the decriminalization of the prostituted person, man, woman, or child. So selling sex or access to one's body is not considered a crime, and there is a degree of investment in support and exit strategies for exploited people. On the other hand, somebody profiting off of the exploitation, what most of us would call a pimp, that is a crime. Unlike Germany, Sweden does not believe in the ethical, kind, harmless pimp. And similarly, Sweden does not believe in the ethical, kind, harmless buyer of sexual access to another person. So a buyer or John is also criminalized. Without further ado, here is the discussion between Merle and Max, with more details and deeper dives into all of this.
My name is Merle Åsbogård, and I'm sitting here with Max Waltman. He is a doctor and an assistant professor at the University of Halmstad. He is a lecturer in political science, and he's the author of the book Pornography, the Politics of Legal Challenges. And he's also done numerous work. Welcome, Max.
Thank you. Yes, that's correct. I recently published an article with Professor Catherine McKinnon. We published in Harvard International Law Journal, and the title is Legal Prostitution, a Crime Against Humanity, ?
We're looking forward to reading that. You have been published both in New York Times and I think Harvard Review has published you.
Yeah, I've been published in a number of scholarly journals since my first publications in 2010 about Sweden's prostitution laws. I also published about pornography and implications for legal challenges and the harm it done both in terms of exploiting the people in its production and also how it affects consumers and how they perpetrate gender-based violence against women and girls as a consequence of their pornography consumption. So that was my book that you mentioned. It took me years to complete. It's over 500 pages and it was published by Oxford University Press. So that's in addition to my journal articles. We have a number of articles in draft to be published. And when those are finished, we prepare to publish a book on legal prostitution, specifically as a form of crime against humanity.
I ask every person I meet this question about what made you interested in this field. So I'm asking you the same question, Max Waltman. What brought you to this field?
It started when I was a student. I was interested in social issues and social problems. And there were a group of professors at the university. I went to Stockholm University for my degree in political science. I know you also have a degree in political science, Merle. And you have to choose a subject to write about. And given my interest in a combination of politics and social problems, oppression, discrimination, I was a bit of a Marxist then. Still have sympathy with Marxist arguments as well as abolitionist arguments. So when I started to write my theses that you have to do as a student, first thesis I wrote about violence against women, and then my second master's thesis was about prostitution and the Swedish law. And that just made me aware of these issues. And luckily, I got admitted to the PhD program. I didn't know everything when I was a student, obviously, about these issues. But I read McKinnon, and that sort of also inspired me to enter this field. And then 9 months into my PhD program, I wrote her an email asking about taking classes of hers, and she responded immediately, "Oh, of course you can come here." And then I read her work about pornography as well, which she has published a lot in. So then I realized at that point that almost no one writes about pornography. Not many people write about prostitution, but pornography even less. But there were a lot of people who wrote about men's violence against women in general, how to improve laws and rape laws. And so I found here's a research gap. Pornography and prostitution to some extent, but pornography is really under-researched.
I have read a lot of different scholars attacking the subject of commercial sexual exploitation. It was way more liberal in the early 2000s. There were a lot of texts mentioning that there was a violence, but mainly that this was something that people did out of their own free will. And they talked about the pimps and the punters and should they have rights and all that. But I can see a radical change. Do you agree with that, or is it still a very liberal climate?
I would think it's different depending on which audience or who you are talking about when it comes to making these arguments. When I was a student in the early 2000s, among university students and professors or scholars who were what you would say today was radical feminists or anti-prostitution abolitionists. But unfortunately, I would say while politicians and people in the movement have become more abolitionist, there has been a growth among academics where you have more liberal professors nowadays who just publish junk science after junk science with the pro-legalization narratives. And they're using not just liberal arguments, but they are trying to push the idea that prostitution becomes more dangerous with abolitionist laws, that it's better to regulate it. But it's a very naive discourse. And why I'm calling it junk science is because they are very selective in their methodologies, and they ignore numerous studies that have been done in the countries that have passed abolitionist legislation, and they don't read the language of Swedish or Norwegian, or they don't care about it. So I'm a bit disappointed in the development in academia. But on the other hand, I've noticed that academics on the left, they have become more liberal. They are not Marxist anymore. They are making liberal arguments, but they think they are Marxist in some sort of distorted way. Whereas real Marxist people who organize, they have accepted and adopted the abolitionist position more as their own. So I think that's a progress. So it depends on which audience and which publication. So I wouldn't say it's that easy that people have become more abolitionist. Unfortunately, that's not what I'm seeing.
When you did your work, you looked back at the law before it was the law 1999, the sex buyer law, the Nordic Model, and you did a work. It's called Sweden's Prohibition of Purchase of Sex, the law's reason, impact, and potential. You discuss what was prior to the law that we all recognize. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that? I'm also, going around doing lectures, and one of the questions I've almost always failed to answer is what was before the law? I know that it was criminalized, but I don't know how it was talked about. Can you talk a little bit about it?
The laws in Sweden were similar to some other countries. There were laws against pimping, or brothels were prohibited, or taking a unreasonable cut out of someone's provision. I don't think it was even permitted to promote prostitution. If you cannot trace the person's actual financial benefit from someone else's prostitution, you could still charge them for other crimes, like they are promoting prostitution or they are renting out apartments. So all that was prohibited, as I recall, except purchasing sex. That was not prohibited. So that was the only thing that was permitted. And I'm not sure exactly which countries have precisely that law today. It depends. Denmark has almost similar, yet they allow small brothels with 1 or 2 people. They are calling them clinics. And then you have in the UK, in red light districts in central London, for example, they permit 1 or 2 women to be in brothels in apartments. That was the law before Sweden adopted this sex purchasing law.
What do you think is the greatest effect from implementing and putting the law into power from 1999?
The best things that happened was that, given the horrendous abuse and exploitation that prostitution entails for mostly women, but also the few men they are still a significant minority, 10 or 15% or something like that. Given that what we know today about the population who are exploited, the majority have suffered severe sexual abuse as children, or they come from poor family conditions, or they have been prior abused. Most people in prostitution have those kinds of preconditions. So the immediate effect was that it decreased in Sweden a lot, several times. In less than 10 years, Denmark and Norway's prostitution increased, while Sweden's prostitution decreased. Less than 10 years after Sweden had changed its law, Denmark had 15 times per capita more women in prostitution, and Norway had 9 times more per capita. Actually, I think 16 times Denmark was the number. And while Sweden, various estimates indicate that it decreased from about 2,500 or 3,000 down to 600 women in prostitution and 50 men who advertised online. So that was a huge decrease of prostitution. And some people have tried to object to these figures, but it's important here to remember, which I explained in the article, that these 3 countries had a joint investigation performed by researchers, a Nordic research group, who had used the same methods in all countries, and the same methods had also been used for the last 10 or 15 years, since the early 90s. So they measured the prostitution in both on the streets, in advertisement, knowledge from social workers, law enforcement, advertisement in newspapers. And so they had these very standardized measures in all countries, and they all indicate the same. And also, it's a known fact that it's impossible for prostitution to be hidden, because if there are no advertisements, if there are no women on the streets, if the Johns don't know where they can buy people in prostitution, it's impossible for them to find new people. And it's also known fact, studies with Johns purchasers, that they want to have new women, they want to have new experiences, as you are probably familiar with. It's an exception that one single John always goes to the same woman. Even if there were some discrepancies in the numbers or exact figures, it would never be able to account for that high of a difference. As like me and Professor McKinnon recently in our latest publication showed if we look at Germany, it's even worse. A few years ago, they measured with similar measurement, and the estimation was that there were 30 or 35 times more per capita prostitution in Germany. In New Zealand, there were 23 times more than in Sweden. And the Netherlands almost 8 times. And then if we also look at the number of men who admit that they have bought sex, there was actually a pan-European study finding that in Germany, there were 16 times more per capita among men in national population surveys that admitted that they had been buying someone for sex during the last 6 months. So there was 16 times more of the men surveyed in Germany admitted to having bought someone for sex during the last 6 months than in Sweden. It was, I think, 12 or 10 times more in Denmark. The Netherlands also 8 or 10 or 12 times. All of these countries that had legal prostitution all had many times more, at least about 10 times more than Sweden during the last 6 months. And those are the real sex purchasers, because someone who has bought sex maybe 3 times their entire life, you cannot really count them as, because if you look at data, it's 4 out of 5 transactions are done by the high frequency consumers. So if you look at all these studies, that's the most clear benefit of Sweden's law. It's reduced prostitution dramatically, many times over, by any reasonable doubt. Another thing is that people are trying to say that prostitution became more dangerous in Sweden, which is a total lie. After the law, no one has been killed in Swedish prostitution for 25 years. And in Germany and New Zealand and the Netherlands, there have been lots of murders of women in prostitution. There were also murders before Sweden changed its laws in the 90s, but they just stopped happening after that. And I've read a number of accounts in different studies that explains why this happened. The Johns nowadays are much more scared and afraid of getting caught. Some of them are abusive and they are violent, but the majority of them have become more careful and they don't want to mess too much with women in prostitution, because one consequence of the law is that they can be reported merely for buying someone. So before, they couldn't be reported for buying sex. So law enforcement could be completely, let's say a woman was raped or assaulted by a John, and if she tried to report it, they could be very judgmental and say, why are you selling sex? This is what you can expect. But nowadays it doesn't matter, because a woman who's subjected to some form of abuse apart from the purchasing of sex, they don't have to report that. They can just report the sex purchasing, and then the police are just going to charge that person with sex purchasing. And that has made the Johns much more careful. And I think that's what explains the lack of murders and also the lack of serious violence against women in prostitution if you compare it to other countries. And if you read Professor McKinnon and my publication about crimes against humanity in legal prostitution, you will find cited page upon page of horrendous abuse in legal brothels all over the world, which you don't hear about that in Sweden or in Norway nowadays. I would say that and the reduction of prostitution is the two of the most important consequences of the law.
Yes, it is important to mention. And also, I know that some listeners might react to saying that, oh, there's no violence in prostitution in Sweden. Of course, there's violence. But if you look at the States, if you look at Mexico, if you look at Germany, we don't find shocked up prostitutes along the highways in Sweden. And also, just an observation, matter of fact, the law in Sweden also moved prostitution off the streets into apartment settings and homey brothels when you contact a person in prostitution in Sweden. You have to leave some trace, a phone call or something. while working on the streets, you don't have to leave any trace. You just disappear. So that is, if you ask me, one of the good things also about the law.
We want to take a brief moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexpose.com, and click the donate button. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode.
When looking at the people's perception of the law, we can see that around the time when the law was implemented, it was not well rooted in the Swedish society. But what would you say is the perception now, the attitude towards the sex buyers law? Would you say that it is more positive? I'm not a scholar doing research about that right now, but I would say that something changed with Me Too that actually moved people's perspective away from that it was unfair, either both should be criminalized or none of them. They hadn't understood the core values of the law, but after Me Too, I feel that people are starting to get it. What do you think? Because historically, we're talking about that this law was written from above, and it was not a law that came from the people. Do you agree?
No, I don't agree with that it was written from above, because there were the women's organization against men's violence against women, the shelter movement, the Swedish women's shelter movements, who met a lot of victims, some of them in prostitution. They were the first organization to lobby consequently for this law. And before they started, there have also been a lot of social workers who meet people on the ground. And if they hadn't lobbied for this law, the government, the politicians, they only care about being elected. That's their only priority. And if no one is there to force them to reconsider their chances to be elected, or important organizations whom they feel they need to have good relationship with, they are not going to propose anything, especially not a controversial law like this. So it wasn't really a law from above. It came from below, like most of the laws in this field. Laws against men's violence against women, abolitionist laws against discrimination in the workplace, laws against exploitation, against unfair labor practices, all of that comes from below. That's just a myth, a law from above. Also, the government, when they passed this law, they were very careful to promote it in information leaflets, in public. Ministers were making statements and all of that. So you could say they educated people, they enlightened the population. And very quickly, just a couple of years afterwards, they did opinion surveys. And the Swedish, both men and women, became much more favorable to this law and more negative toward prostitution in general. So they were favorable to the idea to punish the Johns and decriminalize or not criminalizing the women. There have been studies in other countries, the same trends in other countries, where you can see, for example, the same researchers I mentioned who studied 8 or 10 countries in Europe, they saw that in countries that have, like Norway now have the Swedish law, if you compare those countries with people in Germany and the Netherlands, they are much more liberal in their attitudes toward prostitution. They don't regard it as something that should be abolished. They are less favorable to criminalizing the Johns. So it tracks legislation very similarly. In Sweden, you can say it was probably because they promoted the law. I'm not sure about Norway, to what extent they promoted the law, but you could still see the same public attitudes, and that the public attitudes have not changed since. So even if there are more academics nowadays worldwide who publish more articles advocating for legalizing prostitution, you don't see that in the population of Sweden or Norway. The people are not fooled by academics.
Let's talk about your book. The book that blew up in Sweden, Pornography, The Politics of Legal Challenges
It was my dissertation first, but then I rewrote the book and I cut it and I added a lot of new findings. So it was very much improved and then was published as a book by Oxford University Press 6 years later. The question is why, when we know today how much of abuse and exploitation and violence against women and some men in the production of pornography, and we all know about the consequences the consumption of pornography has on almost virtually only men who consume it, and what they are doing as a consequence of that consumption in terms of sexual aggression, violence against women, attitudes promoting violence against women. So why aren't democracies doing anything about this? So the book is in political science and law. So what's the obstacles for democracies interfere and stop this abuse? So in order to make this argument, I had to divide the book into 3 parts, because the discourse about the studies on and the knowledge about pornography as a form of production and as an impact on its consumers and the type of effect it has is contested by the consumers themselves, of course, but also by academics and the population and the media. So I had to have 150 pages just of the book initially to mercilessly plow into all the significant studies that have been made that document the abuse that it's committed to produce pornography. What type of population is exploited? Mainly women and men from difficult socioeconomic groups with very difficult conditions. Child abuse, sexual abuse, mental health disorders, belonging to racially or ethnically disadvantaged populations, and you pile up all these factors and you get something I'm calling intersectional discrimination. These are groups that are on a large social perspective. They have multiple sources of disadvantages. So that's the population that are exploited in the pornography industry. And I cite a number of different studies and reports in order to triangulate the observation whether this is the correct inference. There have been studies nowadays, several published the last years, actually, the last 10 years, that show that the consumer is quickly desensitized and need more abusive or extreme material compared to what they started with in order to get aroused. So this creates a very strong incentive for the pornography producers to increase the level of humiliation or degradation or violence against women, and also in gay pornography against the men, because they need to be able to get more clicks or more ad revenue or more subscriptions. And when the consumers are desensitized or they will not even view materials, ad revenue will decrease if it's not more extreme in some sense. And that's also why many people, many consumers who go into child pornography, usually they started with adult pornography, but they became desensitized and a significant amount of them turned to child pornography. That's also what many people in the law enforcement report. But this means that the pornography industry just becomes more abusive. And because you have a group of people they are exploiting who have almost no alternatives. There have been studies with the women in Los Angeles pornography industry, in the UK industry. There was the study you participated in here in Sweden with Melissa Furley, that these people don't have many alternatives. They have PTSD, they don't get assistance by social workers that they need. Many are migrants, they don't have the same legal rights, so they are not in a position to dictate the terms under which this pornography is made. So it's either take it or leave it, and they are not in a position to leave it. So when you look at the content of mainstream pornography, the type of pornography that are getting most clicks, most subscription revenue, that have the most, are even among the pornographers themselves regarded as the most commercially successful pornography. It's much more violent, much more abusive, aggressive, dehumanizing, humiliating. Some includes gang rapes, all sorts of abuse than the other pornography that you would find on a free website like Pornhub or those sites where people maybe encounter their first pornography, or people who aren't repeat consumers. So that's part of the exploitation. And then you have, in what ways are the consumers affected of all this? They are totally desensitized to violence against women at this stage when they are becoming more and more involved in pornography consumes. We have 50 years of research, consistent findings that had used the same measurements in study after study, proven measures of violence, of attitudinal changes that are known to promote sexual aggression. That is basically sexual violence, like rape, sexual assault against women, and also laboratory studies where they have made experiments where actually people have given opportunities to be more physically aggressive toward women. And so they have both these measures. They have attitudinal measures that we know are significantly predictive of more sexual aggression, and we also have actual physical measures of aggression against women in experimental situation. Both of these measures, which are causal measures, they show a cause and effect, because if you're exposed to pornography in a lab, in an experiment, you can measure the effect afterwards. So if it changes the person's attitudes, or if it changes the person's behavior in an experiment, we know the cause of this change, because it's in an experiment you can rule out all the other causes. We know it's not about the childhood experiences and all that, because you have a significant number of people, a statistical number of people, and if you have a significant number of those people who are becoming more aggressive after they watch pornography, and you compare that to a control group who didn't watch pornography, you know that you have a causal effect. So you have those studies, and then you have interview studies like the one that Merle participated in. We have women who witness the abuse that the consumers are forcing them to accept. Like the Johns tell them to imitate pornography. The women know that what they're doing comes from pornography because it's a literal imitation of a script that it's easily seen in pornography. And then we have studies, big population studies, where you find a considerable difference between the anonymous studies where, thousands of men or young boys admit to being sexual aggressive against women. And it's a higher proportion of these men who are pornography consumers and who are high frequency pornography consumers than those who admit to lower sexual aggression frequency against women. So we have all these measures that show that the consumers of pornography become more sexually aggressive, and in turn that leads to more sexual aggression committed. There's a very strong correlation between being in prostitution and also being abused and exploited in pornography production. So at least half of everyone who's ever been into pornography has also been in prostitution. And usually, if they're not in prostitution before, they end up in the pornography industry afterwards. So that's why I'm seeing at least half, because when they ask these questions in surveys, you reach a person at a certain stage in their life, and maybe they have only been into one of these, either prostitution or pornography. But even in those surveys, about 40 or 50% say that they have already done both. So prostitution and pornography is tightly connected, and it's the same population that are abused, and it has ripple effects in society in contributing to violence against women as a consequence of its consumption. So knowing all this, I asked, why aren't governments doing anything about it?
That's the same question I think that all of us in the movement have as well. We have so much data showing us how horrific conditions are in pornography, and the damage it does to the viewer as well as the participant. Everyone is in harm's way. But when you try to reach the public in this matter, they go deaf and dumb, like they don't want to discuss this. I try to have a series of discussions with grown people with jobs, their own house key, politicians, and they refuse to even discuss. Maybe even taking away the violent porn. They're like, how are we going to do that? Why is this so hard to grasp in a democracy that in other areas are really attentive to people's well-being? But when it comes to porn, it's like everything is out of the window. What do you think is the problem for them to act on these issues?
Let's dive into your question. Why is the public completely dumbfounded and refuse to acknowledge any of the harms of pornography? While, of course, implicit in that question is that when it comes to regular prostitution, when there is no cameras and no pornography industry involved, people are much more perceptive and understanding in that this is not something good for people involved. They are abused and they are exploited, and legal prostitution is horrible and all of that. People are more perceptive to that argument. And I think the simple response is that there are much fewer people who buy sex, who have a vested interest in the prostitution industry than the number of pornography consumers. Because it's one thing to consume pornography in your own home, in private, and it takes a lot even for a pornography consumers to go out and buy someone for sex. It's dangerous. They can get robbed. They can get reported to the police. That's another reason. You don't get any sanctions from consuming pornography. And the pornography producers, they operate practically with impunity and legally in a sort of gray zone where the government, even though there are a number of laws that could be used, but the police, they don't care about it. My theory is that police and courts, which are basically staffed with bureaucrats. Maybe a judge wouldn't regard themselves as a bureaucrat, or a police. They don't want to see themselves, but that's what they are if you look at it from an objective standpoint. They are there to administer the policies decided by politicians and the public. And they are 9-to-5 workers. It's not like they are artists or painters or musicians. They want to go home at 5 o'clock. So they don't want to start writing judgment or start trying to apprehend people who are doing what almost everyone does. And they don't want to do things that they're going to get a public backlash out of doing. So if they started to actually use the laws that are on the books against the pornography producers, or started to block internet access to pornography, they could charge not just the buyers of women in prostitution in Sweden, not just report them to the criminal offense of buying, which only gives fines or conditional sentences. They could also give the women a right to demand criminal damage awards for suffering from each individual Johns. They could lodge a civil complaint. They have had those opportunities for years to go after much more forcefully against the Johns, much more aggressive against pornographers and all that. But they don't like to do it because they are bureaucrats. And also why the public doesn't want to talk about pornography, that's a totally different thing. That's because the pornographers have been very successful in propaganda, in trying to portray itself as a legitimate industry, and because you have so many pornography consumers in the population, because we have so many pornography consumers, and because it's regarded as a legitimate industry by a significant number of people, the bureaucrats don't want to wade into controversial waters and start applying the laws. When it comes to, for example, freedom of expression, in my book, I go meticulously into case law when things like pornography or hate speech, or, for example, artists who commit crimes while they are doing an artwork. For example, a Swedish woman who enacted a psychotic episode where she appeared to trying to jump off from a bridge, and she was put in restraints by a mental health professionals, and she were shouting at them and she were spitting at them. She was convicted later for a crime because she falsely pretended to be in need of a psychiatric intervention, and she was committed for a crime. Then there have been journalists who were convicted of buying an illegal weapon while they were writing a story for newspapers. So you have to separate what people are doing while they are producing a piece of art or a piece of news or a piece of expression from what you're actually doing while you're doing that. So if you're using children, for example, or if you're buying sex in order to publish pornography, and buying sex is illegal, or if you're promoting prostitution, if you're essentially acting like a pimp, you're actually promoting prostitution, because in the Swedish law, anyone who is involved financially or in promoting temporary sexual acts is committed for an act of procuring, which is the same as pimping. So all that is already illegal, and that's why they could create this new law against OnlyFans. And now in my book, I'm already saying that we already have these laws in place to convict pornographers, because what you're doing is that either they are promoting or they are economically benefiting or exploiting or taking advantage of someone else's occasional sex for compensation. So they're already committing that crime. And we already know from case law, from legal doctrine, that if you're committing a crime like buying an illegal weapon to make headlines, we can buy this illegal weapon in a city of Sweden, that shows why this is a problem, where you're not supposed to do that. These people get convicted for all sorts of crime. It doesn't matter if they are publishing a story, if they are making use of their freedom of expression. We have these laws in place, and it's just that we are relying on law enforcement. We have to write different types of laws. And that's where my work with Catherine McKinnon, who was the originator of this idea. We have to write a law that makes it a civil offense instead, which the women who have been used in pornography or who have been attacked because of pornography, be subjected to maybe a boyfriend who was a frequent pornography consumers and who forced them to reenact pornography, or a person in prostitution who was forced to reenact pornography, or someone who was exploited in pornography to produce. If we give all these women a right to sue for damage awards. Damage awards is something you get for you had been abused or assaulted or violated in a serious way. If we have such a law, it's on the initiatives of these women or men who were abused. It's the initiatives is not among police officers. It's not among the bureaucratic staff of the government. It's not in their power to use a law like that. The only bureaucrat who's involved is maybe the judge, but otherwise it's the women who can hire lawyers who will be representing their interest. And so the lawyers will have an economic incentive to be as ferocious as possible to prove that this law was violated, the law that defined these kinds of abuses as a civil offense. And then, of course, there will be the defense lawyers, but it won't be as difficult as a criminal offense, because a criminal offense has to be proven beyond reasonable doubt. A civil offense is only based on a preponderance of evidence, on a reasonable probability. The standard of proof is lower. And in order to win their case, these women's lawyers will be able to amass a lot of evidence, a lot of horrendous evidence. They will be able to cite the studies, they will be able to cite the individual's experience, their client's experiences. They can do all of that, and it will be public, like Me Too. People will be able to read about it in the newspapers, and the judge will have to be forced to sit there and hear all of this. So it's not like they can just know, no, this is not a crime, we are going to dismiss it. No, the legal system is mandating these judges to sit there and listen to all the evidence. That's how courts work. So if we get that kind of law, we have the system working for us rather than against us. Because if bureaucrats are making all the decisions, the system is working against us. But if at least we can have the initiative, that will be a significant improvement. So that's the argument I'm making in my book. But I'm planning to write more books based on how the Swedish prostitution law is working and how it's also working in France and how it's working in Canada and other places, is that it's very difficult in a capitalist society where the state is run by governments who liberal democratic system is what we have. It's combined with market economy, so it's capitalist. And the voters, they are fighting against each other. The politicians, they have all sorts of demands because the capitalist system is relentless in increasing inequality. So politicians are faced by increasing demand to pay for a lot of things that the market economy is destroying, like healthcare. People have poor schools, education. People are discriminated because they don't have the same resources like other people have. And politicians only care about being elected. So there will never be enough money. In that kind of political system, we will never have enough money for exit programs. We know from Germany, New Zealand, and the Netherlands and Nevada that there are no exit programs. Basically, there are few, but the demand is so huge for exit programs, and there's no way that the government will meet that demand because the voters don't care about exit programs. People in prostitution are like a per mil. They are a tiny population, and they will never be able to, in a market economy where there's all sorts of needs constantly being created by the punishing effect of the capitalist system, which just give much more wealth to the 1% all the time. If we look at the statistic, it's crazy now how 1% own more than 95% of the world's population, how 6 or 7 people earn more than 50% of the world's poorest population. That's never going to be enough. And we can see, for example, in France and Swedish exit programs, they don't really work. And so it's voluntary organizations who are doing all that work. So that's my concern now, that I can see the benefit. The Swedish model has been its decreased prostitution many times. That's a huge accomplishment. But if we want to abolish prostitution, if we want to eradicate it, I don't see how that will happen in a liberal democratic system. And I think we have to be a bit more honest about it, because the critics against the Swedish law, they always say, okay, you have reduced prostitution, but look at your exit program. They can always find fault. And I think some of the faults they are trying to use as information to propagate or agitate against the Swedish approach is really a fault in the whole political system as such. But I don't think we will be able to solve this here in this discussion.
No, but if you were to write something about it, let us know, because it needs to be discussed. You were just touching the whole OnlyFans ban law there. Would you like to talk a little bit more about it?
So the OnlyFans ban that's an extension of the Swedish prostitution law into virtual prostitution, like camming, online prostitution. But the government here, Swedish government, they have extended this law. I think it's the first ever. So it's interesting that Sweden, which was first with the new law against buying sex, is also the first globally to have this law based on the same abolitionist understanding. So while there might be other countries that just ban everything based on a moralistic view, that prostitution is bad and everyone should be criminal who's engaged. That's not the same type of law that Sweden has, because those laws are usually, they use them against the women and then they don't care about the men. So the laws are not really implemented. They are not really used. They're used against the women. But in Sweden is the first country who's adopted this law based on the abolitionist understanding of prostitution. And I was involved in part. I did a literature survey, and I know Merle participated in that study with Melissa Furley, which partly relied on this when they passed this law. So what they can do with the law is that they can go after individual Johns, individual purchasers of camming or online prostitution, but they can also go after the platforms. So they can use the pimping laws against OnlyFans. So immediately after this law was finally passed, when everyone knew that there was no going back, this law would be in place in, I think, July 1st this year. OnlyFans stopped all type of camming in Sweden. So the only thing OnlyFans does in Sweden is that they publish pornography. They publish pre-recorded videos or images of performers, content creators, but they don't publish individually requested materials such as, can you do this video for me? Or can I have an individual one-on-one session with you where you perform all these acts with dildos and strap-ons and whatnot, and where you perform with your boyfriend, things like that. They stopped doing it because they didn't want to get liability as a pimp. A criminal law can be applied against individual decision makers. So, for example, CEO, the responsible managers in Sweden, they have an office in Sweden, so they would be regarded as facilitator, and that would be make them liable under pimping laws, under third-party laws, even under human sex trafficking laws. Because if you can prove that someone was trafficked to produce OnlyFans content, someone was being either forced or deceived, or someone took advantage of a person's vulnerability where they had no other acceptable or realistic alternative to commit to performing these sexual acts for compensation, that third party, that platform would be liable for human trafficking if you could prove their knowledge about these conditions. So they just stopped doing it, the OnlyFans. That's a pretty successful law against these platforms.
And it shows that they will adhere to the law when you put the law in front of them. I don't know if media downplayed it, but I didn't see any writings about it at all. I'm on social media, I read the newspapers, and all of a sudden, people from abroad started to write. One from, I know you were in Cape Town recently, one from South Africa wrote me, one from Colombia. I think I had one from the States. Oh my God, Sweden did it, you did it. And I was like, what do you mean? But now I know more, and now our viewers and listeners know more. So thank you. It is very interesting to discuss how this really inflicts society and what society can take for steps to change the course. But I totally agree, if we don't look at the economical injustice and also all the other injustices, we won't get far. Thank you so much for participating. As we said, it's been a joy to work with you.
Oh, thank you very much. That was nice of you to say. I like this interview format that you have. It's a joy for me to be able to talk about these issues. I try to do it every time I get an opportunity. So thank you.
We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexpose.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexpose.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Expose are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.